And with that, our opening panel. So we wanted to kick off, as Dr. Franke said, with a look at what's going on in Germany. It's been a month now since the elections. I think within Germany, within Europe, in the world as a whole, everyone is very interested to see what's going to happen to climate and energy policy here going forward. Coalition talks have formally started, and who better to discuss than a bunch of journalists who spend their time researching, talking to other people, and formulating their own opinions on what is happening, what should be happening, what could be happening, and so on. So I'd like to welcome to join me up here Susanne Ehlerding, Dr. Christian Geinetz, and Sven Egenter, and we have Philippa Nuttall joining us from Brussels. Yeah, if you want to come up, you can take a seat. Wherever you like. And have we got Philippa as well? Can we get her up on a screen? Right, we're going to get her in a second. So a brief introduction, Susanne Ehlerding, there in the middle, is an editor at a publication I hope most of you here are familiar with, the Tagesspiegel's background Energie and Klima briefing, a daily newsletter about all things energy transition related, particularly with a focus obviously here in Germany. Then at the end, we have Dr. Christian Geinetz, correspondent for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, has been with the paper for 25 years, I saw, as an economics reporter, and is these days also covering climate, energy, and health. Sven Egenter, the editor-in-chief and executive director of the Clean Energy Wire, which is a network I myself and many of my colleagues call upon, a non-profit network that helps journalists cover the energy transition, in particular in Germany, but increasingly also in Europe. And he also heads up the German language climate science communication site klimafakten.de. And finally, who I hope is going to be able to join us, my former boss, Philippa Nuttall, who until recently headed up Energy Monitor, but in September moved over to the New Statesman magazine itself, which is a magazine in the UK, where she's in charge of environment and sustainability, reporting directly to the magazine's editor-in-chief. And she also has a long experience of covering energy, climate, and environment policies from around Europe. Is Philippa there? That's a question to the organizers. Before I ask her something and she doesn't answer, because she's not there. Can she hear us?
I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and we've got a little picture of you now too. So that's
excellent. That's what you need.
Okay, great. So our 45 minutes are going to go quickly, no doubt, and let's get stuck straight into it. Susanne, I wanted to start with you. What would you say, what are the biggest challenges, the big climate and energy challenges facing the next German government?
Well, there are three of them. First, obviously, is scaling up renewable energy, because without it, we wouldn't reach our climate goals. And new government has tough nuts to crack there, I think. One is the overwhelming bureaucracy on the citizen energy. Remember, citizens were 10 years ago at the forefront of renewable energy development in Germany. Also, we have strong barriers for all projects to get permission. And lastly, space is scarce in Germany. It's not with coincidence that we have all these NIMBY initiatives, although acceptance of energy transition is high, but these initiatives are loud, and there has to be a kind of reconciliation with all these people. Then secondly, coal phase out has to come, because 2038 as the date now is far too late, because the Green Party promised to make it earlier. Tragically, coal phase out will come anyway, before 2030. This is what all the experts say, with rising prices in the European yes, ETS.
The carbon price, yeah.
Carbon price will go up. Coal will not be compatible, but the conflict will be that there was a promise to other people working in coal that they'll be safe until 2038, around this date. So I think we will see strong opposition to an earlier date from the lands that are like Brandenburg and Saxony, where the coal mining is. So this is going to be something difficult for the new government. And lastly, to say something positive, we also need a new narrative. Energy transition is not expensive, it's cheap in comparison to what climate change will bring us. Remember the 30 billion for the flash flood victims recently. So we have a good chance in Germany to do something positive, to develop a solution, and this is what I think the new government has to promote. Yeah.
Follow-up questions. One is, I had the pleasure of interviewing the CEO of Ørsted recently, so the world's biggest offshore wind developer, and the number one challenge for him, he said, in developing offshore wind is indeed permission, planning, also for onshore actually, having the land and sea available to actually be able to build, and then getting the permission to be able to use it. Here in Germany too, as you said, that's an issue. Do you see any any innovative thinking on the political front or within policymaking circles to tackle that? Because it's an old problem, it's not a new problem. Is there a new way of actually doing something about it?
Well, I can't speak for offshore. The one new thing that will be tried is to have new looking at how to protect nature, how to protect animals. So before now, the law is that we have to look them at the species level, and if we change this and look at the level of the whole population of an animal like birds, and we will see them that an individual may be protected, or I don't know. Other people say we should have land for biodiversity, and then not for, and then develop wind in other places more easily. So this is what people promote, yeah.
Okay, and the other question on the coal phase out, if coal is going to come to an end anyway, simply because of how things are evolving, many people are saying, is there a need for the government to change the phase out date?
Yeah, in fact, I don't see the need. There's more like a political obligation that Greens will feel, and I think we will solve this problem like we always do in Germany by throwing money at the problem, or even more money. So yeah, this is not easy to resolve.
Okay, let's move on to Christian then, Dr. Geinitz. If we look, I guess most people here will be aware, but the coalition talks have formally started now. How do you see those shaping up? What are the big sticking points? And in particular, obviously, the Greens and the FDP come from very different positions on climate change, maybe not so much on the end goal, but certainly on the means of getting there. Is there any reason to think they are going to be able to actually agree on something, a way forward?
They will have to agree on something, and I mean, you put the finger right into the thing, and Susanne, the same. The question is not, do we want to change politics, but how do we change politics in that respect? And the aims are clear, and they have been clear for a long time. Now, they've been sharpened a bit in the recent legislation, but it is clear what Germany wants and needs in this coalition. And when you look at the coalition talks which are coming up, they should be based on the famous Sondierungspapier, which I have here, which in some ways seems pretty inconcrete, but on other terms it is pretty concrete. And one thing is, that it puts at the very front the fight against climate change, and all parties will have to live up to that expectation. Now, the question is how. One thing which will be discussed first is the shaping of the ministries, which is an important point at the moment in political discussions here in Berlin. If the FDP gets the finance ministry, and they will not get that go away, because last time they did, they failed and they were kicked out of the Bundestag because they didn't live up to the expectations of their voters. So they will definitely try to get that ministry. Then you will have to offer the Greens, which is the bigger party, something, and which will probably be some kind of super climate ministry. Now, what will this super climate ministry take in? Which other ministries will it absorb? That's the big question. If you look at the 22 coalition groups which are formed right now, you have still have a mobility coalition group. You have an environmental. You have an agricultural group, and you have the big climate group. Which, interestingly, one of the members is our now environmental minister, Mrs. Schulze. Now, she changed from Umwelt so from environment to the climate changing group, which is interesting to watch. As for contents, and you'll probably run on that later on, but this is the constellation. You do not only have cleavages or conflict points within or between these three groups, as you mentioned, between the liberal Greens and the liberals, but you also have, within those groups, you have things which are not sorted out yet. Think of, you mentioned that, Susanna, within the Greens, you have the people trying to protect species. They have different interests in the way that we want to put up new wind generations than other Greens might have. Within the Social Democrats, you have that different approaches towards social equality. Olaf Scholz said before the elections, he will not want people to be forced to buy new electric vehicles. He wants them to get the money back that they have to invest now in high energy prices and the rest of it. And for the liberals, the big issue is how can we finance all that? Is it possible to not break the debt rules on the one hand, and not impose new taxes and spend billions and billions in new energy? So, sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, we'll come back and follow up on content in a moment. I'd like to turn to Philippa then, as a kind of outsider looking in, since you're not German, you're not in Germany, but obviously what goes on in Germany is of interest to, I guess, to other countries, to the rest of Europe, to the world, to some extent. What would you say, I mean, from an outside perspective, what do you perceive as the main challenges and the possibility of German climate and energy policy going forward now? What are you most interested in when you look at Germany?
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. I think what's been said already is all clearly very correct, and I think from an outside perspective, clearly people are interested now to see what does change now that there will be a new government in place, that the Greens will be part of that government. I think also the momentum that was engendered during the election campaign and how the new government, once it's in power, builds on that. I think there's also an interest to see what happens at COP. It's obviously Angela Merkel's last outing, what difference that makes or not, and the level of ambition or not that will bring. I mean, she herself has obviously admitted that she's perhaps not been as strong on climate as she could have been. And then obviously I think in terms of the coal phase out, even though, coal would probably disappear before 2038 anyhow, I think it sends a strong signal if Germany does come out and say it wants to phase out coal much earlier by 2030, and also how Germany manages that you have these pockets obviously of certain regions where the people still working in the coal industry or connected to the coal industry are based, and to see how Germany manages that to make, as Suzanne mentioned, that it is more of a just transition, and it's not a transition whereby people lose jobs or feel that they're not part of what's happening. So I think there's clearly a lot of attention on Germany at the moment.
Okay, so you'd agree with Susanna that the coal phase out, regardless of what might happen through market forces, bringing that date forwards is important from a political, a symbolic perspective, and other countries will be looking for that, and also looking at how Germany then handles that in a very practical sense. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also in the COP, this is one of the things that we really need to see, is that countries are ready to actually move away from fossil fuels and not just talk about it, not just talk about offsets and ways to sort of carry on as Western countries have been, and not really make that move away from fossil fuels. So I think the setting things in stone like a 2030 phase out from coal sends the right signal, increases the momentum to say that we're not just waiting for market forces, we are actually ready to step away and make those proactive steps to move away from fossil fuels.
And then one question in terms of the potential implications for European policy. So obviously Germany is, a very, well, perhaps the most important, but a very important player in the European Council. Also the centre-right, the European People's Party, has dominated the European Parliament for a long time. If there is now to be a centre-left and SPD chancellor, that whilst there may not be a radical shift in climate and energy policy terms within Germany, it could nonetheless change the power dynamics at least a little bit at European level. Can you say anything, I guess, about how substantial that change might be, or whether, to what extent it will make a difference for things like Fit for 55?
Yeah, I think that change would already happen to a certain extent. So, I think, the legacy of Angela Merkel has been, to a certain extent, undermined by close ties that she did have with various industry groups, probably most notably the car industry, and that even relatively recently, I think at the last car salon in Germany, she was still sort of hedging her bets around, whether we're actually moving towards just electric vehicles or whether we need, more options in the mix, and this real need to move away from the internal combustion engine. So I think that's something that will change, but I think that's already changing clearly, because German car makers such as Volkswagen or others have made it very clear that they will move away from ICEs and put their eggs in the electric vehicle basket. So I think that if there is more ambition coming from Germany, and obviously just because Germany, the size of Germany and the power that it holds within Europe, that can change the dynamics quite strongly. And I think especially because the UK is no longer there as well, that what bigger countries such as Germany does is clearly very important, where they go and where they take the debate in Europe.
Okay, thank you. Let's bring in Sven then. So I know in the run-up to the German elections and afterwards, the Clean Energy Wire has also organized briefings for groups of international journalists. So you have a lot of exposure. And I guess I would ask you, therefore, following on from Philippa's point of view, what's your experience of how the rest of the world is kind of living this current debate in Germany?
Yeah, that is really an interesting question, and it was quite an interesting time actually for us, because the shift, what we've seen compared to 2017, when we really also covered the election pretty closely and offered our sort of briefings to international journalists, has been massive. And I think it is a reflection of a notable change in the international environment, in the perception of what Germany does, which is also reflected actually in the World Energy Council survey. I think it gets a bit lost, in my view. I've been here at these proper events, the sort of change that has happened, not to the positive, but to a sort of more sort of interested way of looking at it. It's not as polarized anymore. Germany is doing either something totally foolish or something heroic to save the world. It's more like, oh, what they're actually doing could be quite interesting. Not everything, but a lot of these things. And that's reflected in our briefings, actually. That's, in 2017, I always tell the story that my team and I basically were counting the non-mentions of climate and energy policy in the German political debates. We put out stories saying climate and energy gets not mentioned in chancellor debate. I don't have to tell you here in this room how that has changed over the last 2 years. And that's a reflection of an international change, and that's reflected in the interest coming from international media. So the general perception was, the big question was, will Germany now, on the political side, and that's interesting to hear what you've said, descend into some sort of protracted coalition building that is very difficult and full of fraction and friction. And I have always said, like, be careful, it could take a while. I have to say I'm quite surprised actually right now by the speed. Maybe we'll live up to a bad surprise, but right now I don't see that. But other than that, the interest was really now in how will take Germany on the big challenges, which, given that the Green Party looks likely to form part of the government, it's seen as a given. If you talk to international colleagues, they expect Germany to be more active on the energy transition and on the climate front. And then it's the subjects you mentioned. I mean, the reflection, and Philippa actually mentioned, just transition, how does that look like? Can you bring forward the coal phase out and all these things? And let me just add one thing. I still think it's notable in Germany, in our own coverage and in our own discussions, but also abroad, how little emphasis the European angle gets. We still debate energy policy in Germany as if this was something that we could decide totally independently and that has no repercussions to our external world. Not everybody and not everywhere, I know, but in broad terms, that still happens. And there was quite some criticism of this paper, actually, not mentioning the EU angle and the G7 angle more strongly in the Sondierungspapier. So I think, and that is also reflected internationally, that this is still underplayed, this sort of connects between Germany and the European Green Deal and the European Union in the wider sense.
Yeah, okay. We have one question come in, which I'll take right away. Probably, I guess any of you can take it. From Professor Graham Wheel. He asks, can the panel imagine that the German constitution would need to be changed to give climate measures precedence over other fundamental rights? Otherwise, the renewable permitting process will remain a continual hindrance to decarbonization. And he's from Ruhr University of Bochum. So I guess that's a question over how far, we're talking about a climate super ministry, how far do you think the next government may go in imposing net zero as a fundamental right? Could the constitution be changed to give climate precedence over other fundamental rights? I.e., you want to build that wind farm? Well, you can build that wind farm.
Of what we need is so strong now in Germany that we wouldn't have to change the constitution to make possible what has to be done.
Okay.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not a lawyer, but maybe it's interesting for the fact that when you want to speed up the whole planning process and the rest of it, there's talks on bringing through laws which would enable this construction of wind energy parks and the rest of it. Maybe that is easier once you have a higher level of legislation within the constitution to implement these laws. But as I said, I'm no lawyer. Maybe that's completely wrong what I'm saying. But we definitely need a debate about existing laws and how these need to be changed to enhance the fight against climate change. And within that framework, might be a good idea to look at the constitution again. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just one line. I think the Constitutional Court, German Constitutional Court, had a look at the Constitution and said, well, you're not giving climate action enough room. Full stop. I mean, that's so. I'm not sure that we actually need a change. We need to first politics to live up to what the Constitutional Court already said. I mean, then we can start talking, I agree, about, do we need to go further? But right now, I would say, I mean, we still have, and your surveys show that, a long way to go to live up to the current ruling of the Constitutional Court.
Yeah, fair point. Are there any questions in the room before I carry on? If you have one, you're welcome to put it. Don't see any for the moment. I wanted to then ask about the current, I mean, we find ourselves in a very special energy situation, energy crunch, energy crisis, energy price crisis, and presumably this is having an impact, whether we like it or not. It might be short term, maybe not, hopefully it is, on both the talks within Germany and then on wider events like the COP. Philippa, do you want to, I guess because you're going to be at the COP soon, but in terms of how this impacts everything from the COP, and then specifically also what a country like Germany can commit to at this stage, how is this influencing the debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's influencing the debate clearly in many ways, and I think it comes back to the issue of the just is what we said. Can you still hear me? Right, it's what we said before, is that the energy transition, the move towards net zero, climate action can't be stopped. I mean, I think it was Susanna who said as well that the cost of inaction will be way more than the cost of climate action. So we have to move forward. We don't really have a choice, but we need to make sure that I think there are two things. That one thing that it's very clearly understood by policymakers and the public that it's gas prices that are largely causing the energy crisis, or whatever we want to call it, and various other factors that have all come together to make a perfect storm. So it's not because that we're moving towards renewables that we have rising energy prices is one thing. And secondly, this need that the poorest people in every society, so it's not just a question of developed countries versus developing countries, but every country, including in Germany, will have to have the support that they need to both potentially pay higher energy prices. So for example, in France, Emmanuel Macron has given, I think it's €100 to the 600 poorest households. Spain, various other countries have come forward with concrete plans to support people, but also that people can then take part in the transition, whether that means insulating their houses, installing heat pumps, etc. So I think this idea of a just transition and really making sure that this is a key part of policy making, both in Germany and elsewhere, is extremely important, that we can marry the energy crisis and also the climate agenda.
For those of you within Germany, do you see, I mean, the current context, I guess, unlocking new opportunities, influencing the debate in some way, shutting down other options? In Brussels, suddenly you start to have discussions over power market, electricity market design. Maybe we've just revised it, but maybe we need to revise it again. So there are new subjects appearing, at least at European level. I think the just transition, indeed affordability, I mean, is suddenly there. How is it affecting the talks in Germany, and with what kind of lasting implications for climate and energy policy? Because they're happening now, the coalition talks, whether we like it or not. Who wants to?
I mean, it will speed up the debate about the just transition. How will we pay for energy? Because if we get the CO2 price we need, energy prices will go high in the next 5, 6, 7 years. So we can prepare for what will happen now regarding the soaring prices. But I'm not sure whether this will have a long-lasting effect. Everybody says the prices will go down next summer or next spring. So, and the hope was a little bit that it will promote renewable energy because it's cheaper. We can't be blackmailed anymore. But I think this will be forgotten if once gas prices will fall again.
Does it change the discussion over the role of gas in the German energy mix going forward?
Maybe you want to answer this.
Well, in this famous paper, they're announcing to build new gas plants, and to the general public it looks odd. On the one hand, you turn down, you do the coal the coal plant phasing out regime, by which you also switch off modern power plants, not to forget. And on the other hand, you build up new gas plants, other fossil plants. I know that the carbon footprint is different, but still, to the general public, it sounds odd to do that. And it is indirectly saying we haven't done enough in the past to change to the renewable energies, and we're running into a power problem here, which we are trying to fill that gap by opening new gas plants. I mean, look at our energy provision now. We have what, 11% nuclear power still. We have 30 to 40% fossil. Next year we'll shut down all 6 nuclear power plants. And if the coal phasing out is, as is suggested here again, done already in 2030, something will have to happen in between.
No. But then there's, okay, if new gas plants are part of the plan, there's a very practical question at them. I mean, the commercial case for them has been difficult so far, to say the least. The current price crisis isn't helping, I'm imagining. So are there ideas on the table for actually getting them built? Because that's been a big challenge, as far as I'm aware, until now, and it looks to be getting harder, not easier, for there to be any kind of commercial case for building a gas plant. Have any of you heard any ideas for how to actually make that happen?
Who wants a gas plant in his backyard? I don't know.
Well, another question, if they're saying they want to build some, presumably there needs to be an idea behind that of actually getting them built, whether or not you think it's a good idea.
The problem, we have old problems and new problems. And one of the old problems is that, yes, the commitment is there, maybe building new power plants, maybe building new transmission grids, which is a very, very important, crucial problem here. So the commitment is there, but will they get it done? I mean, you know,
At least building new gas plants makes perfect sense in a system with a lot of new renewable energy. I mean, it depends on how many hours the gas plant will run. So hopefully we will need it like for something like a capacity market. And this, I can live with the gas power fossil plant for this. Yeah.
Well, I agree with both of you, but that will be an interesting part of what's now to come in the coalition talks. I mean, the Sondierungspapier, this starting point, does not mention detailed measures. And, one of the things that has been around ever since I started in 2014 is, reforming the market setup in Germany for the energy market and the electricity market in order to allow the right sort of investments. And, we won't know, I mean, whom am I telling this? I mean, we won't know whether there's a fair chance of that reform actually happening until we see the details from these working groups and their commitments. And then we'll have a fair chance of assessing, whether we are heading in a direction that allows to buffer all these needs between now and 2030, and then also beyond 2030 with the right sort of market layout. Let me just add one thing which I find notable in its absence so far in mentions around the whole gas debate is also largely absent in the debates about the new political framework is how do we boost energy efficiency and how do we boost it in particularly for households. I think industry always has a strong incentive to be more efficient because it brings down their cost, so that should be some sort of almost a given for a company to try and reduce its energy costs and optimize its energy costs. But on the household level, that looks totally different. And maybe I just missed it, but so far, I haven't heard a lot of debate about that. And when you talk about, bringing down and going for just transition, it's the most vulnerable in society who cannot afford to optimize their own energy usage without some sort of support.
Yeah. Philip, I don't know whether you know this, but it's usually when we look at Germany and the Energiewende, we talk about renewables much more than efficiency. Do you have any sense of whether indeed other countries are also interested in Germany as an example of efficiency, or indeed, as Sven says, that's a little more off the radar? Certainly from my perspective, it's true. When you think of Germany, people talk about it as an example of how to do, or lessons learned at least from, in terms of renewables deployment, not so much efficiency or building renovation or that kind of thing.
Thanks, Sonia. It's interesting you mentioned that because I was interviewing somebody yesterday in the UK and they cited Germany's great record in terms of energy efficiency compared to the UK, and how Germany has managed to come forward with a system whereby there are loans and grants, and it's a relatively simple system compared to the UK, which has tried to put various systems in place, and they've never had a very they've never lasted more than a year or so. And that Germany is actually a good example. So yes, I think people do look to Germany and do see Germany as an example in terms of efficiency. Whether that's warranted or not from inside Germany, it will be interesting to hear. But from a UK perspective, Germany is definitely doing better. The other thing Sorry.
It's all
having lived in a London flat with single glazing and no insulation at all, I can totally see, that the starting points are slightly different.
Yeah. I think it's also in terms of the system that Germany tends to put something in place, perhaps, and not always, but stick with it a bit more than has happened in the UK in recent years, where various schemes have come into place. They've lasted a couple of months. They've not necessarily been funded properly. And so there's a lot of expectation of how a better system could be put in place. The other point I wanted to mention as well, which I think is relevant for everybody, and especially with a new government coming into place in Germany, it's very easy to look to 2030, to look to 2050, whether it's in terms of gas plants or renewables or efficiency. And this real need now that we need sort of almost yearly targets to actually look properly in terms of what's happening, in terms of bringing renewables on board, in terms of why we need gas and where gas is needed or not needed. And this idea of looking out to 2030 or looking out to 2050, it's quite easy to make decisions which today may make sense, but don't make sense if we looked on a slightly more incremental basis to really see how we can ramp up year on year and not look to these long dates.
I wanted to come back to the idea of sort of climate ministry or super ministry for climate, and I guess how that might affect climate and energy policy going forward. My experience is more at the Brussels level, where there is now a climate directorate that was created not that long ago. So it was separated out from, I guess, the environment departments. Now we have the European Commission has an environment department and a climate department, energy department, transport, all of these are separate. At the time though, under the Commissioner Connie Hedegaard, it was not the massive hit everyone was expecting. In a way, mainstreaming it made a lot of sense. On the other hand, it meant that she didn't have, it lost some of the momentum it had when it was part of environment, and she didn't have the same resources at her disposition to ultimately push through ideas that had been pushed through when it was still all part of the same bigger environmental department. So it can play out in different ways. Now, of course, climate is all the thing. I mean, in other countries, climate and energy are put together. In Brussels in the past, transport and energy were put together. So there's various ways of organizing it. So since you mentioned the idea, Christian, do you have any more thoughts on, I guess, what would actually be part of it, what not, and what might be, what might make it the most effective possible institution going forward?
Yeah. Right now we have the separation of the climate issues between the environmental ministry and the economics ministry, and this will probably be put together. So we have energy, climate, and the big question is what else? Mobility, transport. You can think of a lot of things, but then again, and that's the thing that you always have to reconsider in Berlin is you also have to find enough ministries to satisfy everybody. It's sometimes as easy as that. It would make perfect sense to put all these environmental climate issues into one big ministry. And it does make even more sense now, as I said before, because you will have to find something where the Greens are at their own turf on the one hand, and where they're strong enough to face Christian Lindner as a finance minister from the FDP side. So there are a couple of reasons why it makes sense to come up with this super ministry. But again, arithmetics, you will have to find enough posts for all these people out there that are now in the other ministries. But from the from the content point of view, it makes perfect sense to put all these things together. I mean, I've been covering this for only a year now, but I've seen all these issues between environmental ministry and the economics ministry and the transport ministry from all different parties. I don't think anybody would like to see this again.
Are there any questions from anyone coming up to our last 5 minutes or so? Anyone here? Yes, Jensen over there. Could you just walk up to the microphone? I hope it's on. And just tell us very briefly who you are.
My name is Mike on, yes. My name is Hans-Peter Bögen, formerly Siemens, now retired. And I have a question for Mr. Egerter. You mentioned that in the German climate policy, the European perspective is more or less not mentioned. And I would say not only the European perspective, especially the international or global perspective is not mentioned. And That brings me to a kind of climate political paradoxon in the German climate policy. The more we do to reach climate neutrality or CO2 neutrality in our country, the less we do to help really combat climate change, because this question is not solved in Germany, it is solved in the world. It's mainly solved in South and in Asia. And we spend all the money to reach a national goal, which is a more symbolic goal from my point of view. But at the end, maybe we have not left any foreign investments to help states in Asia to replace, for example, their pretty young coal power plants with other technologies.
Yeah, that is a very good point, which we hear quite frequently. Germany is too small to make a difference. You hear the same in the UK, you hear the same in any country, basically. I mean, we need to be clear, and I don't think that anyone has any doubt here. Each and every country, if we're serious about the Paris Agreement, has to go to net zero, full stop. So we will have to make these investments in Germany anyway. Now, you can discuss the order in which, do we start here, or do we start in China and India and other places of the world? But there, politics comes in. I mean, even if that was a logical pathway, I challenge you whether you as a minister in Germany would say, oh, now we're not spending 50 billion in Germany, now we're sending 50 billion to India. Good luck with that. That would be my answer, frankly. I mean, if the one thing doesn't happen, the other thing has to happen anyway. We should optimize it. I agree with you. And I think when we talk about politics in Germany, there is huge leeway to make things more efficient and smoother. Susanne mentioned some of the key blockages. Christian mentioned some of the key blockages. Philippa in Brussels, I completely agree. But this notion that if we don't spend the money here, it's get spent more intelligently elsewhere, I would, frankly, I would really challenge that notion.
Susanne?
Yeah, just to add, because you mentioned young coal power plants in Asia, ADB, the Asian Development Bank, has planned to buy out these power plants to the governments to retire these plants earlier. We will come up in 2 days with an interview on this, and they will launch the whole thing next week. So there are people taking care of young power plants in Asia already. So that's it.
Yeah.
One more thing. I mean, we haven't completely forgotten them. Just yesterday, there was a new plan of how to revitalize the 100 billion plan of countries from the north, supporting those in the south, which is one of the things why the industrial state's credibility is going a way of fading away in some parts of the world. I had the chance to discuss with the South African Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she said, as long as you don't live up to your $100 billion goal, why should we move at all? I mean, I couldn't quote her on that, but and so it's not that we have forgotten them, but we've been very, very slow in financing them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And someone has written in to say as well, are we working enough with developing countries to fulfill our climate and energy goals? Because we will depend a lot on green energy imports going forward. So there is a self-interest there. We're at 11:30, so I think we're going to have to leave it there. There were a few other questions around pyrolysis of methane to continue decarbonization, gas power plants for the conversion of biomethane. I think those are probably too technical for the debate we have, and we do have a hydrogen panel later in the day, so pyrolysis can come up there. There was one question I'd end with, just a yes or no from everyone, which was, does CCS stand a chance in Germany within this decade?
Yes.
Yes or no? Yes.
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 Okay, Philippa?
Well, I think somebody has to sort of remain sceptical. So I've been writing about CCS for, 15, 20 years, and I still like to be convinced by what's actually going to happen everywhere.
So was that a no more than a yes?
It was a hesitation between the two.
Okay.
Very diplomatic.
Okay, yeah, we're at 11:30. So the time has flown by, as I suspected it would. I want to thank all of you for your time, the 3 people who could make it here. Philippa, I know you would have wanted to be here, but obviously you're preparing your COP trip. Thank you for joining us virtually, and thank you for those of you who sent in questions. A round of applause for our first panel.